So for the past few years, I've been making content about Chinese culture, Chinese language, and everything that revolves around my own interpretation of and connections with being Chinese. While I never claim to be an expert in sociology or linguistics or any of those academic fields, I think my content does come across as if I am really passionate about my own culture and I just really love everything about being a Chinese individual. And here's the truth. The whole thing has been an act of overcompensation for me to get over some pretty serious trauma. Yup. Hey there, this is Winnie, and if you have followed me on other social media platforms, you may have known me as Third Culture Chinese. That is the username that I came up with when I first started my social media journey as a bilingual webcomic artist. It's Third Culture Chinese because I am a Chinese individual and I grew up as a third culture kid, which means I have spent my formative years in multiple different cultures. I was born in China, I moved to Japan when I was really young, I moved back to China to start school, and I moved to the United States in my middle school years, moved to Singapore during my high school years, came back to the United States for college, and I have been staying here ever since. I think moving globally has become a lot more normal these days, or at least a lot more normalized because of social media and representation. People are just a lot more open to this kind of stuff than back in the days when I was moving around. And throughout my globally mobile lifestyle, I would say that being Chinese has been the core of my existence and my identity. Nowadays, I fully embrace being Chinese, but that wasn't always the case growing up. Actually, for many years, I actively wanted to go against it. I actively wanted to shed the Chineseness of me. I think in America, it's a very common narrative for Asian Americans to reject the Asianness in them in order to fit in their predominantly white peers, especially during the formative years. That wasn't necessarily the case for me. There was a part of that, but my biggest reason was that I wanted to forget my trauma. In my childhood, China was obviously my safety net, my comfort zone, my everything, my whole existence. I lived in Japan when I was really young, so Japan didn't really form an impression in me, but China was really my first hometown. And in that hometown, in that comfort zone of mine, I was groomed and raped by someone significantly older than me. And it wasn't a one-time thing. It kept on going for over a year. And the only reason that it stopped was that I moved abroad. I moved to America. That was already traumatizing enough in itself. But what really shattered my trust with the system was that I felt so alone and I felt like I was demanded of shame. I don't believe in generalizing a whole culture because of one person or one instance. So the takeaway of this video is not that Chinese culture is bad or that Chinese culture protects rapists or that Chinese men are bad. No. At the time when this whole thing or things unfolded, I was already pretty close to leaving China. So when I did leave, there was an overwhelming sense of liberation. America is by no means perfect, all right? I need to set the record straight. There is a lot of systemic injustice that infiltrates all parts of society. And life as a new immigrant at a place where almost no one speaks your language and the system is completely different than that of your hometown, and you have to adjust to the new system and assimilate. It is hard. And it was hard for me because not only did I have to get acquainted with my school system as a teenager, I also had to help my parents with legal documents and all that kind of stuff. But there was this strange sense of empowerment in all the pain and discomfort I experienced in my new community here in America. Because for the first time in my life, I felt a level of agency. I kept on telling myself that we chose to be here. I didn't choose to get groomed. I didn't choose to get raped. My mom was the expat. She had an employment opportunity in the United States and brought me and my dad over. And I don't think she knows that she brought me out of a hellhole. Once I grew to be comfortable in the American system, I started rejecting anything and everything that defined my past. I obviously used English in school, but outside of the school setting, I started using English more and more. In my diary entries, in the content that I browse on the internet, and even in my conversations with my parents. as a way to erase the trauma that Chinese language has brought me because it was the language of my predator. Nowadays, as an adult, obviously I wouldn't associate a language with my personal trauma anymore. But when you're young and your last memory of your home country is that of sexual assault, it's gonna do something. I made a webcomic about how the different languages that I speak feel to me, and I'm gonna read it to you guys. My first language, Mandarin Chinese, was like a blanket. It was soft and warm and smelled like the sun. I felt safe when it was wrapped around me, until someone tried to suffocate me in it. My second language, American English, felt like metal plates at first. They were thick and foreign, but I wore them like an armor to shield me from what once hurt me. As time went on, English started to feel like an oversized hoodie. It never fit me quite right, but provided me with the level of comfort I needed. In it, I jumped, I danced, I hugged a lot of people. Eventually, it became all I wore. I wanted to pick up that cozy blanket again, but it didn't smell like the sun anymore, and I could hear my scream from decades ago. If immigrating from my homeland by birth to my homeland by choice was a journey, then using my second language to explore my heritage is an expedition. One of relearning, reconciling, reconnecting, and letting go. Some of you guys asked me in the comments, letting go of what? It is not letting go of the language, thankfully. It is letting go of my resentment toward that language. By the time I moved to Singapore, I was ready to present myself as the American Winnie. And by the way, I received my nickname Winnie in New Jersey when I first moved to America because my actual first name is Yun Yun, and it's Yun Yun without the tones. And English speakers had a really hard time pronouncing Yun Yun, and they would say Win Win. So later on, Win Win became Winnie. I loved Singapore. I loved my experience there. And I definitely felt very fortunate to attend Singapore American School. If you have never been to Singapore, Singapore is a city-state located in Southeast Asia. It is majority Chinese, but it's an English-speaking country. It celebrates diversity and inclusion in ways that I think America could learn a few things from. But to me, Singapore was a really important turning point in my life. In Singapore American School, I met other third culture kids who grew up around the world just like I did. And outside of Singapore American School, I got to see my own culture with a different spin. Like what I had said, Singapore is a Chinese majority country, but it is an English speaking country because it used to be a British colony. In that environment, I was introduced to a lot of Chinese traditions that I personally had never participated in because they no longer existed in my hometown. Better yet, I learned all of those in English. I learned to accept and preserve my heritage without necessarily using the language that brought me pain and shame. Singapore was the beginning of my heritage journey, I would say. So thank you, Singapore. Majula Singapura. Just when I thought I had resolved everything, that I had come to terms with my Chineseness, I came to college. I went to Lehigh University, and I met a lot of international students. The majority of them came from China. Despite all the moving that happened in my formative years, I kept my citizenship, so I am still a Chinese citizen. In college, when I met other people from China who were Chinese citizens, like I was, I felt like we were very different people. Their mannerism, their interests reminded me of my middle school years, and you know what happened. This is absolutely not their fault. If anyone were to blame in this entire thing, it would be my groomer. Anyway, I didn't know how hurt I still was because I thought enough time had passed. Obviously, it wasn't enough time. So what did I do? I told everyone that I was from Singapore instead of from China. And that was not a lie because I directly moved from Singapore. And Singapore was a very significant point of my life because of, what I said. Singapore helped me in a lot of ways resolve my resentment toward culture, but it didn't resolve my resentment toward the language. The international Chinese circle seemed to be pretty tight. So of course, there were rumors that I just hated China. I did hate China. Yu Xingao, and Ye Chao, and Wen Jingwei. If you were raped in middle school and placed in a system with no agency, I feel like you would too. So my college years witnessed my tug and war between my trauma/resentment and my urge to be rooted in heritage that stemmed from my identity crisis from moving all over the place in my formative years. In my senior year at Lehigh, as part of my art major requirement, I took on a capstone project and I started making webcomics. I had always been inspired by a couple of comic creators, and I wanted to use that capstone project as an opportunity to tell my story and straighten out some records. The comics were in English only at first, and the theme was being a third culture kid. I didn't quite get into the Chinese part yet during that semester. And that was the beginning of third culture Chinese that you see on the internet today. As I started publishing my work on social media, third culture Chinese got a lot more attention than I had anticipated. I got like 20K followers during that semester, and I thought, wow, this can be a thing. This can be something that I continue to do outside of college. And I did. In my early days as a webcomic creator, a lot of people in the comments were curious about the Chinese side of me. They kept on requesting more Chinese comics, more bilingual comics, and more comics about Chinese culture and language and that kind of stuff. I wasn't quite ready at first because of my trauma and also because I didn't have the best reputation as a Chinese person at Lehigh. Eventually, I gave it a try. I'll be honest, I at first started making bilingual content and picking up Chinese as a way to satisfy my audience. Behind the scenes, I was very reluctant. I think at that point, enough time had passed that I had already been a little bit desensitized. So I kept on making more and more content to, number one, satisfy my audience, and number two, hopefully to undo the hurt that I had been feeling for a very long time in my life. I got so much support from the Asian American community, among which so many have had similar experiences of rejecting your cultural identity and later on reaccepting it, even though the reason might be a little different than mine. Before making webcomics, I didn't know that people would be interested in my story at all. I also didn't know that there were this many people who also struggled with their relationship with their native languages. I sought refuge in my second language, English, and I'm still doing that now. This video is in English. But through the support that I've been given on and offline, I think every day I am able to accept my past and love my native language, Mandarin, a little bit more than before. Plus, I am the one telling my own story, and it feels so good to write your own narrative. While I am comfortable enough to face my trauma head on now, my healing is still an ongoing journey. I don't think I'm quite there yet. So do I still hate China? No, of course I don't. There are aspects of a culture to be cherished, and there are aspects to be criticized, and Chinese culture is no different. But your connection with your culture is your personal journey. However you feel is valid. If you have gotten this far, thank you so much for listening to my rant, and thank you for being on my healing journey with me. I used my webcam to record this video, and I think I need an actual camera. Alright, 再见 for now.